There are television shows that entertain you, and then there are television shows that become a part of who you are. Lost in Space was the second kind. For 3 seasons between 1965 and 1968, millions of American families gathered around their television sets every Wednesday night to watch the Robinson family tumble through the cosmos, fight rubber-suited monsters, and somehow find humor in the middle of genuine danger. The show generated one of the most beloved casts in science fiction history. It launched careers, destroyed others, sparked a secret romance, and concealed behind its cheerful exterior a collection of stories so raw and so human that most of the people involved spent decades refusing to tell them in full. Now the cast is nearly gone. June Lockhart, the warm and unshakable matriarch Maureen Robinson, passed away in October 2025 at the age of 100. Mark Goddard, who played the tough and dependable pilot Don West, died in October 2023. Jonathan Harris, the irreplaceable villain turned comedy genius Dr. Smith, left in November 2002. Bob May, the man who gave the robot its soul, died in January 2009. Dick Tufeld, the voice that made the robot's warnings legendary, followed in January 2012. Guy Williams, who was promised the lead of the entire series, died alone in Buenos Aires in May 1989, undiscovered for nearly a week. What remains are 3 survivors: Bill Mumy, who played Will Robinson from age 10 to 14 and is now in his 70s; Angela Cartwright, his television sister Penny, the same age; and Marta Kristen, the eldest Robinson daughter Judy, now past 80. These 3 have outlived nearly everyone who shared those sets with them, and in the time since the others have gone, they have finally begun to say plainly what the cameras and the network contracts and the polished interview answers kept buried for 60 years. What follows is the real story of Lost in Space. Not the version the network approved. The version the cast actually lived. To understand what Lost in Space became, you have to understand what it was supposed to be. In late 1964, producer Irwin Allen filmed a 60-minute pilot called No Place to Hide on a budget that made industry veterans do a double take. At approximately $600,000, it was the most expensive television pilot ever produced up to that point in American history. Allen brought in a cinematographer with multiple Academy Awards to his name. He hired a special effects supervisor who would go on to win an Oscar of his own. The writer he chose for the script would later contribute to Star Trek. And funding came from an unlikely coalition that included CBS, 20th Century Fox, and 2 of Hollywood's most recognizable comedians, Red Skelton and Groucho Marx. The pilot that came out of all that investment was something genuinely striking. It was quiet, intelligent, and completely serious. The Robinson family, a mother and father both holding advanced scientific degrees, 3 gifted children, launched their spacecraft toward Alpha Centauri with the fate of an overcrowded Earth depending on their success. A meteor storm knocked them off course. They landed on an alien world and had to survive using nothing but their knowledge, their instincts, and their loyalty to each other. There was no comedian in a rumpled jacket scheming against them. There was no robot waving mechanical arms and shouting warnings. There was no catchphrase. Will Robinson sat around a campfire and sang an old English folk song, and the scene played with the quiet dignity of something you might find in a film, not a Wednesday night network slot. When Allen screened the finished pilot for CBS executives, they responded with what he had least expected: laughter. Not mockery, but genuine delight. They bought the series on the spot. Then they handed him a list of requirements that changed everything. They wanted a recurring villain who could generate weekly conflict without forcing the writers to invent entirely new threats from scratch. They wanted a robot. They wanted more energy, more color, more of everything that had been deliberately stripped away to make the original pilot feel like cinema. Allen considered suggesting Ming the Merciless from Flash Gordon. His story editor had a different instinct, something closer to the treacherous Long John Silver, morally slippery and entertaining rather than purely threatening. They landed on Dr. Zachary Smith. Nearly 80% of that original pilot footage was eventually cut apart and grafted into the first 5 episodes of Season 1. The writers solved the continuity problem simply. In the new scenes, Dr. Smith and the robot had stayed behind at the ship. That explained why neither of them appeared in any of the footage shot months before they existed. The Jupiter 2's interior set alone cost $350,000 to build, making it the most expensive standing set in television at the time, more than the entire bridge of the Enterprise on Star Trek. The theme music was composed by a 24-year-old named Johnny Williams, a fact that nobody highlighted at the time because nobody yet knew that Johnny Williams would eventually become John Williams and write the scores for Star Wars, Jaws, Schindler's List, and Indiana Jones. The serious version of Lost in Space was locked in a storage vault. The colorful one premiered on September 15, 1965, and immediately became one of the most watched programs on American television. Jonathan Harris was not supposed to survive the first 5 episodes of the show he ended up defining for 3 years. Dr. Smith, as originally scripted, was a cold, calculating saboteur, a spy who murdered a security guard in the pilot's opening sequence and reprogrammed the Robinson family's robot to kill them in their sleep. He was written to be despised and then written out. Harris read that script, understood exactly what it meant for his career, and made a quiet decision that would change the entire trajectory of the series. Harris had built himself from nothing. Born in the Bronx to Russian immigrant parents, he grew up in a 6-story tenement building, changed his surname from Karasukin to Harris at 17 over his father's fierce objections, earned a pharmacy degree he never intended to use, and then talked his way into an acting career by sheer force of reinvention. By the time Lost in Space arrived, he had accumulated over 100 stage productions, appearances on The Twilight Zone, and a reputation for immaculate vocal precision and an almost predatory attention to text. When he read Dr. Smith's dialogue and found it blunt and villainous and terminal, he started rewriting it overnight. He would arrive on set each morning with entirely new pages in hand. According to Bill Mumy, who watched this process unfold as a 10-year-old with wide and fascinated eyes, Harris would walk through the day's scenes with the other actors and announce simply that he had changed the dialogue. The changes accumulated. Smith's menace softened into cowardice. His scheming became transparent and almost pitiful. And the insults, the cascade of alliterative, inventive, endlessly creative insults hurled at the robot, appeared in no script that any writer had produced. Harris constructed them himself. Bubble-headed booby, nickel-plated nincompoop, bellicose bumpkin. He explained his reasoning with the kind of clear-eyed, creative logic that most writers spend careers failing to achieve. The robot was intelligent enough to see through Smith's schemes, so Smith had to attack it constantly to keep it off balance. Every insult was a survival mechanism wearing the disguise of comedy. By the time Irwin Allen grasped the full scale of what had happened, 500 fan letters a month were arriving addressed specifically to Dr. Smith. Allen had no leverage left and no realistic desire to use it. He acknowledged later, with a candor that must have cost him something, that Smith had not been designed as a comedy character at all. Harris had simply decided what the character should become and then made it happen. Harris negotiated a special guest star credit on all 83 episodes, a billing structure that reportedly had never appeared on American television before. He had arrived as a character meant to die early and turned himself into the reason people tuned in. Guy Williams walked onto the Lost in Space set with more star power than anyone else in the cast. For years, playing Zorro for Disney had made him genuinely famous, not famous in Hollywood famous, but famous to children across America famous, which in the mid-1960s was a different and arguably more powerful thing. He was tall, physically imposing, trained with a fencing sword since age 7, and possessed of the kind of easy authority that made producers believe he was born to lead. John Robinson, the brilliant mission commander, was written as the heart of the whole enterprise. This was going to be Guy Williams's show. What happened instead unfolded with the slow, almost courteous cruelty of a tide coming in. In Season 1, Williams's screen time began to contract as Jonathan Harris's storylines expanded. By Season 2, the pattern had become official policy. By Season 3, it was simply the reality that everyone on set had accepted and nobody discussed openly. Williams would arrive, deliver a handful of lines establishing some plot point, and then stand in the background while Harris, Mumy, and the robot carried the episode from beginning to end. Mark Goddard, who played pilot Don West and experienced his own version of the same erasure, described the atmosphere on set with straightforward honesty. The show had shifted away from the family and toward Smith and the robot, and Guy Williams felt that shift in a way that was difficult to watch. Harris himself acknowledged the damage he had caused, which is a remarkable thing for someone who never stopped causing it. He said openly that Williams had been hired as the lead of the production and had ended up with a handful of lines every other week, a situation Harris described as genuinely difficult for any actor to endure. He was right about the difficulty. He simply never stopped being the reason for it. Williams filled the long hours between his brief appearances with chess games, classical music, astronomy books, and stock purchases. Bill Mumy gave him a nickname, the Comb, because Williams spent every spare moment between takes grooming himself, a way of channeling restless energy into something harmless. On at least one reported occasion, the frustration surfaced directly. Williams reportedly turned to Harris and said, with absolute conviction, that he was going to kill him, before catching himself and adding that he meant Smith. Whether the correction was genuine or theatrical, nobody who heard it thought it was entirely a joke. When cancellation came and Williams's Hollywood career failed to recover, he discovered something extraordinary waiting for him on the other side of the world. His Zorro had become a cultural institution in Argentina. The government offered him a luxury apartment in a marina. The wife of President Perón invited him personally to perform at a charity event. For the last 2 decades of his life, Guy Williams lived in Buenos Aires as something approaching royalty, celebrated by a country that had held onto him long after his own industry had let him go. He died in May 1989 of a brain aneurysm. His friends in Argentina only discovered it when he failed to appear for several days and police entered his apartment. He had been gone for approximately a week. He was 65 years old. Bill Mumy later said, quietly and without embellishment, that after the show ended, he never saw Guy Williams again. Not a single time. Every child who grew up with Lost in Space loved the robot. It was impossible not to. The flailing accordion arms, the spinning dome, the deadpan warnings delivered with perfect comic timing. The robot felt like a character rather than a prop, and that feeling was entirely the work of one man that most of those children never knew existed. Bob May walked into the Lost in Space audition by taking a wrong turn. He had been at 20th Century Fox looking for work on a different production entirely when Irwin Allen's team redirected him and asked him to try on the robot suit. The test was brutally straightforward. If you fit inside it, you had the job. When May climbed back out after his first session, he was bleeding from cuts left by the raw metal interior edges. He took the job. The suit weighed roughly 200 pounds. Under studio lighting, the interior temperature climbed to what May later described as the equivalent of a personal sauna. The costume was nearly airtight, and on at least 2 confirmed occasions across the 3 seasons, May lost consciousness inside it. His eyes would roll back, his body would go limp, and it would take a moment before crew members noticed that something had gone wrong. The production company's official response each time was that the schedule did not permit delays. May was a devoted smoker and found a way to satisfy the habit between takes by lighting cigarettes inside the costume. June Lockhart recalled noticing smoke drifting through the robot seams and finding it quietly peculiar. According to a story that circulated for years among the cast and crew, Irwin Allen arrived on set one afternoon to find the apparently stationary robot emitting visible